Hello everyone, my name is Mrs. Weber. I'm excited because I'm trying some new technology that I hope that my students will be able to utilize not only for going back and reviewing some information, but also for those that are absent, the ability to go back and actually view the lecture that they may have missed in class. So I'm hoping that this all works out and that this is a piece of technology that is going to enhance my curriculum in my class. So with that, let's get started. All right, so today's essential question is, how is cause and effect related to science? Okay, so by the end of the lecture today, this is what everyone should be able to answer, is explaining cause and effect and its relationship to science. All right, guys, so what is cause and effect? You can think of cause and effect as an if-then statement. Do you guys all remember those books when we were growing up? If you give a mouse a cookie? Okay, give me a second. Let me go ahead and pull up those books. No longer is it just if you give a mouse a cookie, but now there's all these different storylines, like if you give a moose a muffin, if you take a mouse to school, if you give a pig a pancake. Okay, so now there's all these if-then storylines that they have that show this idea of cause and effect. Okay, so some other if-then statements that are more related to science, you have, if a plant is not watered, then it will die. Or how about, if Mrs. Weber is not given her coffee in the morning, then she will be very grouchy by fifth period. These are all things that we can actually investigate in order to figure out what exactly is the thing that is causing something to happen, or what is the cause for the actual effect. All right, what I'd like you all to do in your notes right now is go and actually write your own if-then statement. So you're going to come up with something that if this, then that is going to be the actual consequence. So I want you all to write in your notes, if this, and then fill in the if this happens, then the consequence is going to be, and then you're going to put that. I'm going to give you guys a few seconds to accomplish this. All right, now what I want you guys to do is, now that you have your if-then statements, I want you to go ahead and share your statement with your table partner or with your elbow partner. So you're each going to sit there and you're going to share your if-then statement. You might ask the question, what does cause and effect actually have to do with science? Well, the purpose of an experiment is to ask a question about what is causing something to happen. So we can actually do experiments to determine the thing that is causing an effect to take place. In science, there's two main variables. There's the independent variable, and then there's the dependent variable. Okay, the independent variable, this is the variable that I like to think about as being the variable that I independently have control over, or I independently can change or manipulate as the scientist. The dependent variable, on the other hand, is the response to the change made by the scientist. It's the variable being measured or observed. It's essentially the effect, the thing that we are looking at, the thing that we believe is the consequence of the thing that we changed. Remember, the thing that we changed is the independent variable. A controlled experiment is important because you only want to change one variable at a time in an experiment. If you change more than one variable, then you don't exactly know what change is causing your effect. Let's think about the controlled experiment. If Mrs. Weber has coffee in the morning, then she's not going to be grouchy by fifth period. What are all the possible variables that could influence Mrs. Weber's grouchiness? With your elbow partner, I want you to sit there and brainstorm all of the things that could potentially cause Mrs. Weber's grouchiness. Okay, all of those things that you and your partner just brainstormed, those are all of the things that we would want to keep the same in this controlled experiment. We would want to ensure that all of those things remain the same and that the only thing that changed in this experiment was Mrs. Weber having her coffee or Mrs. Weber not having her coffee. And that thing that we are changing, we call that the independent variable. So in a controlled experiment, we only want there to be one independent variable, one thing that we are changing, because we are asking the question if that one thing is causing the effect of what we are actually observing. And remember, the thing that we are observing is the dependent variable. We have two main variables that we've talked about so far. So let's go ahead and review them. We have the independent variable and we have the dependent variable. Okay, so students a lot of times struggle with the difference between these two. But here's a little technique I like to use in order to remember the difference between the two. What letter does the word independent start with? Okay, it starts with the letter I. So the way I like to think of the difference between these two variables is I think I am the scientist. Therefore, I independently can change one variable. Okay, so as many of you know, this I also represents the Roman numeral number 1. Okay, Roman numeral number 1. And remember, how many variables do we want to change in a controlled experiment? We only want to change one variable. And that one variable that we want to change, okay, that Roman numeral number 1 is the independent variable. Remember, it's the one that is changed by the scientist. And I am the scientist, therefore I independently change one variable. Now the dependent variable, this is the other variable. Okay, so the dependent variable, this word right here, depends or is responding to the change that is made by the scientist. Okay, so the independent variable, I independently change one variable. Why? Because it's a controlled experiment. We only want to change one thing because we want to know what is the one thing that is causing the effect, the dependent variable, that thing that we are measuring or observing. Okay, so remember, the dependent variable is the thing that's being measured or the thing that's being observed. Okay, so now that we have gotten the idea of the independent and dependent variable under our belt, now let's go through the scientific method. Okay, the very first step of the scientific method is to ask a question. Okay, that is why it is so important in science for us to be curious, because the first step of science is to ask, what is the cause of something? Why is the sky blue? What causes earthquakes? Why is global climate changing taking place? Will we ever run out of food? How do things change over time? These are all questions that we can ask to figure out the cause of the actual effect. Okay, now once we ask a question, our next step is to form a hypothesis. Okay, now a hypothesis is an educated guess. Okay, but what we are doing as we are guessing is we're trying to figure out the cause of the effect, which is why it is appropriate to put the hypothesis in the form of an if-then statement. Okay, so in this class, I am always going to expect any time that we are forming a hypothesis that you put it in an if form statement. So if we were to add fertilizer to a plant, then we would expect it to grow more. Or if we stop watering a plant, then we would expect it to die. If we studied more, then we would expect our grades to go up. If we went to bed earlier, we would not be tired in the morning. Okay, so these if-then statements, okay, we are forming them in order to make a claim. This is what we believe is causing the effect. So hypothesis versus theory. Okay, remember a hypothesis is an educated guess. Okay, so it's the explanation for what is causing something to happen, the cause of the effect. So recall in this class, we are going to write our hypothesis in an if-then statement. A theory, on the other hand, is essentially a hypothesis that has been tested by various scientists and is generally accepted as being a correct explanation to a question. So some examples of a theory is the Big Bang Theory, the theory of evolution, the theory of plate tectonics, the Big Bang Theory. These are all examples of things that have been tested by numerous scientists, and there is a large range of evidence that supports the actual theories. Models are important in science. They're simulations or predictions based off of previous data that we've collected. Models allow scientists to do experiments that they would not be able to do otherwise, or they provide diagrams that are larger than the actual real life thing themselves to allow people to have a better understanding of what it is that they're studying. There are so many different types of models that exist. You have models of a cell that you could take a look at to have a better understanding of what's going on inside of a cell. You have models of the human body that you could take a look at in order to understand what's going on inside of the human body and the different anatomy that exists inside of the human anatomy. There are diagrams that you can use. There's just so many different forms of models that exist. So models are beneficial because they allow scientists to make predictions that they may not have been able to predict otherwise. So, for example, if a scientist was trying to study a tornado, they might be able to make a simulation inside of a bottle to understand the shape and the effect of the tornado, but you wouldn't just be able to snap your fingers and automatically create a tornado. So they're beneficial in that regard. Now, some models have actual limitations as well. So let's think of our actual lake itself. In Lake Elsinore, we could ask some questions about our lake in Lake Elsinore, what questions about Lake Elsinore could you actually ask? What I'd like you guys to all do right now is go ahead and turn to your elbow partner and brainstorm some different questions that you guys could ask one another about our lake, about Lake Elsinore. Now, to answer some of these questions, you may want to do an experiment, but it would not be appropriate for us to do those experiments in our actual lake itself. But what we could do is we could use a model in the form of an aquarium to actually do some of the experiments that you guys actually asked, or to answer some of the questions that you guys may have asked. Okay, now let's go through some practice. So we've talked about quite a few things in this lecture. We've talked about different variables. We've talked about the independent variable, the variable that I am the scientist independently change. Remember, that's only one thing that we want to change in the experiment. We've also talked about the dependent variable, the variable that is being measured or that is being observed. It's responding to the change that is made by the scientist. There's also the controlled variables. So those are all of the other variables that exist in an experiment that we want to keep the same. Okay, so what I'd like you guys all to do now is in your notes, we're going to practice. So here's the question. Does fertilizer affect the growth of a plant? So the very first thing I want you to do in your notes is list all of the different variables that exist that could affect the growth of the plant. Then what you're going to do is you're going to identify the variables that are the controlled variables if you were to actually set up this experiment. What are the independent variables, that one thing that you as the scientist are going to change in order to ask the question, does fertilizer affect the growth of the plant? And then you're looking at the actual dependent variable. What are we measuring? What are we observing? What are we trying to actually figure out in the actual experiment itself? All right, now what you guys are going to do is you are going to complete your summary in your notes. Guys, remember, anytime we do a summary, what we are doing is we are coming up with the answer of the essential question. Okay, so the essential question for this lecture was, what does cause and effect have to do with science? Remember, all of your sentences need to be 3 sentences at least answering the essential question.